Hi everyone, we got Doc Arash from the Prehab Guys, and we're going to help you pass the CSCS getting into chapter 22, which is the rehab. And it's nice having a good looking hunk like this to pick his brain and learn for the athletes that you're working with that do get injured. And so the big thing in this chapter is they're going to be talking about the types of injuries, but really just tissue healing. And so wanted to get the professional themselves to kind of break that down a little bit more for you all so you have a better understanding. And then we'll take a look at things that we can do, and maybe we shouldn't, and also some misconceptions out there around maybe some old school acronyms like RICE and so forth.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks for the intro, Chris. Yeah, so I mean, should we just dive into what happens with an injury?
Yeah, well, so you got an athlete, and let's just keep it simple. And I always like to use injuries that I have, so then you can help me. But like, say you sprain an ankle, or you have a proximal hamstring strain, and how should we go about working with that?
Yeah, great example. So both of those would be traumatic in the sense that there's one specific incidence that created the onset of that discomfort, whether it's an ankle sprain, oftentimes that ATFL, or a proximal hamstring strain. And so initially you'll get a bit of that inflammatory response, which is very normal after an injury. And it's actually helpful because it does help with sending some chemical signals to create healing for that specific area. Now, a lot of people are worried about inflammation and say, we don't want any inflammation, but optimal amount of inflammation is actually helpful. And during that early stage, let's take that ankle sprain, for example. Well, with an ankle sprain, there's one thing even before trying to rehab is ruling out a fracture, which is not common, but it's part of the Ottawa ankle rules, just making sure that there is no fracture of that, especially that fifth metatarsal, which can happen. So once that's ruled out, if there is any positive signs from the Ottawa ankle rules, then refer out to get an X-ray just to rule out the fracture. If there's not, and we're not thinking it's a fracture, we're thinking it is an ATFL sprain or a proximal hamstring strain, then at that point, during that inflammatory phase, you want to respect that tissue. You don't want to strain that tissue. Oftentimes that includes stretching it. You don't want to elongate that hamstring or put that ankle into plantar flexion inversion. You want to keep the body part moving. You want to allow for the ankle to move within tolerance. Same thing with the hamstring, but you don't want to move it too much. The movement does help with facilitating some of that natural muscle pump to allow for clearing out a lot of those additional or the excessive amounts of inflammation in that area.
Yeah, I'm going to get a little nerdy because I always see some of these terms. I don't know if I'm saying them right now. Are those was it PHYGO, those phagocytic cells? Is that what those are called?
Phagocytic, yeah. There are those. There's a lot of these chemical mediators, like different white blood cells. Phagocytosis is just the process of eating up those older cells. There's a huge histamine response that creates a lot of that. There's a lot. I know in PT school we had a full-on document on each phase of tissue healing and all the chemical signals that happen. It's very insane. I mean, the amount of things that occur, but a big picture, the white blood cells get rushed to that area to try to create healing of whatever tissue was damaged.
And so a big thing with that initial injury is there is a neuromuscular disruption. And I don't know if if I'm speaking correctly here, so you make sure that I'm current, but there is some type of miscommunication when there is an ankle sprain and like glute work. Is there some type of tie in those?
Yeah, there is. I'd say first, when the ankle goes into plantar flexion inversion, you can see how the ATFL is the first passive structure to limit excessive plantar flexion inversion. So if you go into excessive plantar flexion inversion, yeah, the ATFL may get sprained. But then after that, the peroneal muscles will get pulled on. And so you'll notice a delay in peroneal muscle activation oftentimes after an ankle sprain because of that excessive motion. And so that in itself, in addition to obviously poor proprioception of that ligament that's now been sprained, creates poor ankle, foot and ankle stability. And then I'm not sure if it's causation or correlation. I'd have to take a bit of a closer look with the research, but there is definitely something going on with glute activation and those that have ankle sprains. I'm not sure if it's after the fact or, I would imagine poor glute activation in general probably is a risk factor for certain things, but it's hard to say. Definitely having an improvement in proprioception of your foot and ankle and optimal peroneal activation will help with minimizing risk of ankle sprains, though.
So this would be the one time that it is, beneficial to do some type of unstable surface training, whether it's a Bosu ball, Eric's pad, or something alike, right?
Yeah, pretty much. So if you're talking about balance, there's the three systems. There's vision, there's vestibular, and then there's proprioception. So those three things give you the ability to balance. Now, what I often do is you can try challenging the proprioceptive system. Oftentimes I'll even just remove one of the other systems. I'll have them close their eyes. Now they're relying on the vestibular system and the proprioceptive system. Or I may try to minimize the vestibular system by having them rotate their head. If they're rotating their head, whether it's up and down or side to side, you're moving all those inner ear fluids. Now, when you do that, you limit the ability for the vestibular system to tell you where you are in space. If you really, really want to challenge just the proprioceptive system, you take out the other two, close the eyes and move your head. Now try to balance. It's extremely hard because the only thing you're relying on is your proprioceptive system. That's what I like to do to rule out the other two systems and make sure that we can focus on proprioceptive. You can also just challenge the proprioceptive system, like you're saying. Put a AirX pad. Those WAFs are becoming popular now. Anything just to create a little more instability will also challenge the proprioceptive system, even if you keep your eyes closed and you don't worry about moving your head a ton.
Essentially, that's as you're a legend in the book. Look at Dr. Arash right there in elite physique. That's the tracking your balance one, the tricking your balance that he does right there, right? That's the
yeah, that's right.
Visual. But then, my ignorance, what is somatosensory?
No, somatosensory is it's the same thing as proprioception, pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think of them synonymously.
Somatosensory. Is that how you say it? Somatosensory?
Somatosensory, yeah. Somatosensory. Yeah, ability to detect where your body is.
Okay.
That way you get the feedback on where you are. If you're moving one direction, your body can adjust itself back to midline. Sutter.
And so as the coach, where do we get into load management? And when do we I look at the ankle, it's the size of a fucking grapefruit. Icing may help with pain, but it's not gonna, it actually may be contraindicative because it may delay the process that the body naturally should do. Same with like NSAIDs, right? Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories.
Yeah, the pretty much I'd agree with that in almost all situations, aside from an acute bout of swelling from trauma. So like if someone has their knee goes into valgus and you're thinking something like an ACL injury or ankle sprain, proximal hamstring strains don't really swell up a ton. I mean, they definitely can. They certainly can. Muscle strains can, but ligaments, bone or muscles do get good blood supply. That's why muscles are the color they are. But tendons don't often swell up as much. Ligaments and muscles definitely swell up a lot. So like if you have this massive grapefruit ankle, what you can ice for the first 24 to 72 hours. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's some research to support that even, but after that, it's only a pain mitigation thing, like you said. And if it feels good, great, but I also wouldn't rely on it a ton because we do want some of those inflammatory mediators there to help with tissue healing. If not, then you may overdo it. Even you want to avoid overstressing the area. But to your question, it's hard to always find the optimal load. The key is optimal load. You don't want to completely disuse the area. So you can do things like ankle circles, some ankle pumps. If you can go for maybe some balance exercises in the meantime, great. And then you can progress it from there. But regardless, keep working on other muscles. That's why I love using BFR for proximal muscles. We can still build up strength with the quads, the glutes, the hamstrings, and plenty of other non-weight bearing ways to make sure in that situation of an ankle sprain, someone's staying active and strong. With the hamstring example too, there's a lot of different ways that you can keep the other muscles engaged and minimize atrophy there. And with the hamstring example, I'd love to use isometrics as early as possible. You want to avoid stretching the tissue. So you want to avoid doing any type of hamstring exercises throughout the full range of motion for that first little bit. And it's always hard to give exact timelines. Usually, let's call it the inflammatory process lasts about 6 days, but it also depends on the severity of the injury. There's some times where the inflammatory process can last 2 weeks. Sometimes it could last 2 days, but it's the patient or the client will help with guiding that decision making based on their symptoms with a traumatic injury. Oftentimes, I don't let pain be a guide for progression because pain and damage, and we've kind of talked about this in the past, pain and damage or tissue damage are not perfectly correlated, and you don't want pain always to be a guide, but in the acute injury instance, I allow for it to help me guide the progression of movements.
Now, what about some old school wives' tales, if those are true? I remember when I was in physical therapy, like early 2000s, this was the clinic that did the ultrasound and stem and all that stuff, but they would talk about how important it is in the beginning to switch back and forth between ice and heat to pump it out and expedite the process. Is there any legitimacy to that in the early phase, or
no? Not really. The biggest benefit in the contrast, the ice is the most helpful in that acute phase, but only to a certain extent. You don't want to overuse it either. But the most important thing in terms of pumping and clearing it out is actually just moving the ankle and finding ways to continue to move it very, very consistently. I'm talking like every 1 to 2 hours.
Yeah.
There's ankle exercises that are being done in that ankle sprain situation.
And that's tough because there's physicians that will still stick to old school methodologies. I had a student, and this was probably like 7-8 years ago, and she softball over the weekend, sprained it, and she got an x-ray, nothing, and it's probably a grade 2 sprain, and the doc put her in a boot, and I said, I'm not a physician, you can't listen to me, but I don't suggest that. I think that you should put some weight on it. And so she stayed in that boot for 3 weeks, and then she got blood clots, and then she was out for almost 6 months, and she had a nasty issue. And I don't know if it's safe to say that that was avoidable, but there's a lot of situations like that, and it's one of those things where it's like physicians don't go through what you guys go through, and so they maybe get this superiority complex. Oh, I can injuries aren't that big of a deal, just let me fix you.
Yeah, that's always one of the biggest issues I battle with as well, and this happens more times than not. And it's also potentially fear on the patient's end when there is something going on. Their body and their brain tells them, hey, let me do absolutely nothing to this area, let it heal for 8 weeks, and then go to PT afterwards, or go to see someone to progress me back to my sport when my pain is gone after 8 weeks. The problem with that is, like you said, yeah, there's risk of certain things like blood clots, but then also we're starting from such a negative spot now. There's so much atrophy, there's so much secondary stiffness because that ankle, that whole leg hasn't been moved. And just to get back to baseline is going to take us a lot of time versus having worked through it. So if the goal, I mean, certainly that person can still get back to their activities, but if the goal is to get back to activities as safely and as quickly as possible, the answer is not to boot up for 8 weeks, unless there's something significantly wrong, or maybe if they just had a fairly big operation. Like if someone has like a massive rotator cuff repair, I don't even want to move it for a good amount of time, oftentimes close to 6 weeks, just because the risk of tearing that is fairly high within that first year, and you don't want to push it. But with an injury that is non-op, you oftentimes want to find ways to move it, because that's what's going to help with healing, not just keeping it sedentary. But it happens, unfortunately, more often than not, and it slows down that individual to get back to sport. So hopefully that narrative can change. And I know we're putting a lot of content as well, trying to push the change in that narrative, but for whatever reason, it's still being recommended, and people feel like that's the right thing that they should be doing. And
it's tough for the strength coaches, because you ultimately want to help your clients, and you could have one case like that, and then it goes to the strength coach's head, like, I was right and don't listen to doctors anymore. And that's another unfortunate rash decision right there. But for those that are listening who are strength coaches, and you have, so like a scenario, I'm a basketball coach, one of my players sprains an ankle, it's pretty bad. When it goes to going back into play, I remember when I was at the University of Connecticut, the athletic trainer told me to do the 5-hop rule, which was, if you can jump on that leg body weight and catch yourself 5 times, it's probably not anything structural. And if he is okay to go out there and play, probably okay. But if you can't jump up and land on that leg, then you have to like brace yourself that maybe you shouldn't get back in the game. Or is there anything like that we could use for a rule of thumb?
certainly, yeah, there are definitely good tests that you can do. Number one is making sure that the strength is there. The limb symmetry index will recommend, like, the side to side strength will want at least 90% of strength on the involved or the problematic leg. So you want at least the strength to be there before you even start testing any plyometric or jump based movements. Once that's achieved, that's the foundations, because some people can still compensate and still manage to look good with jumping, even though their strength, that foundational piece, is not there. And we don't want that person to get back to sport, because that's already a risk factor for injury. So once that's there, then we can do, there's 4 tests, part of the hop test. You're jumping, the 4 tests are basically, you're jumping straight forward for three single leg jumps. You're doing another one across a line for 3 jumps. You're doing a single leg jump as far as you can, and then you're doing another one for speed. All these exercises are single leg, and you're comparing the involved leg versus the non-involved leg. And that's a great test for returning back to playing sport. But like the reality is, you can only test so much in a gym or a clinic for someone returning back to sport. Like for basketball players that I work with, I'll make sure those are all cleared, and then before they get back to sport, I'll progress them, where it's like, let's start with one-on-one, play for a certain period of time. Okay, great, that's good. Then you can go into a little bit of a scrimmage, maybe a 3-on-3, not full court. Let's see how that is. Depending on the flexibility that individual has, and then you can get into a full scrimmage, and then you can get back to a game, something like that. And each one of those progressions may have micro progressions with how much time you're spending playing 1-on-1 or 3-on-3 or 5-on-5. It's too hard to just do a certain battery of tests and say this person's cleared for sports.
Yeah,
I think people want that solution, and there are plenty of tests that will say they can help with that. But the reality is, every sport is unique, and you don't see how someone moves in a fatigue state, which is why sometimes I'll even fatigue someone beforehand with a bunch of potentially BFR lower extremity exercises, fatigue their legs completely, and then let's see how they're moving. That replicates the fourth quarter, the ninth inning, the third period. Like these athletes oftentimes get injured when they're a bit more fatigued. So making sure we see how they're moving in that fatigue is helpful.
I think that this stuff's always fascinating to me because I always wanted to go to a PT school, but I was too dumb. So I think as a strength coach, for those that are watching this, I think, and I want Rosh's opinion on this, but it's why not just link up with a therapist and just make yourself that much better? So, we have clients that show up. I know there's one in San Diego that messed up his ankle. He'll send me the video. I send it to Arash. He'll take a look at it. And it's so much easier. And it's fun to learn in the process too, versus me trying to, dabble around in an area that really isn't my scope. And so you're just going to be better off. And especially if you're working with high school kids, you're going to come off as way more professional when you're talking to the dean or whoever, the parents. Like, yeah, I'm a great strength coach. I can help your kids, but also I have a dietitian on my team. I also have a physical therapist. So if something were to come up, you're in the right hands, because most coaches are going to take that approach where I took a corrective exercise cert, so I can fix anyone.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I learned a lot from you as well. In the meantime, it's a collaboration, making sure we get these athletes back to where they need to be. And that's part of the teamwork.